Hey there, this is the Drafting the Past podcast, a show all about how historians research and write history. I'm Kay Carpenter, and for this episode, I got to interview two authors who wrote a book unlike anything I have featured on the show before. Historian Rick Jobs and anthropologist and illustrator Steven van Wolputte teamed up to write, illustrate, and create In the Land of the Lacandon, a graphic history of adventure and imperialism. Part graphic history, part historical essay, part poetic commentary, and more. The book not only tells the history of one moment in 20th century imperial exploration and anthropology, but it also takes apart the act of historical research and narration and turns it inside out for the reader. As you'll hear in the episode, I think it would be an incredibly useful book for teaching what historians do and the limitations to how we do it. I had a great time talking with Rick and Steven about how they conceived of and developed the project and how they collaborated across countries and formats. Our conversation also delved into the possibilities of historical narrative itself. I think you're going to get a lot out of my conversation with Rick Jobs and Steven van Wolputte. Here's Rick first.
I'm a historian of modern Europe. I did my graduate work at Rutgers University a while ago. And I've most of my work has been in history of youth and young people and pop culture, 20th century stuff. My first book was about post-war France. My next monograph was a very big project dealing with youth travel and backpacking, history of backpacking and Eurailing and interrailing and that sort of stuff. Yeah, and I teach at Pacific University, which is a small private liberal arts college, no graduate students. I'm in a history department of 3 people. So very much teaching centered, but I've, maintained an active academic scholarly sort of agenda or profile. Steven?
So I'm Steven, and I'm an anthropologist, social and cultural anthropology at KU Leuven. We have a slightly bigger department than Rick has, which probably is not that difficult. And most of my work is situated in Southern Africa, mainly Namibia, and nowadays also South Africa. And I worked mainly in the border region between Namibia and Angola with cattle herders. So it's very far away, quite literally an ocean away from the Lacandon. And what I've been publishing on a lot of stuff, ranging from popular culture to music to beer. I like especially my beer book on futuring, making futures. And then the latest one is the one that you have read.
How did you come to illustration?
When I was young, until I was 16, I liked to make comics myself. And then there's a hiatus from about, 30 years or something. And then I start to, basically, I wanted to do something with something that one of my co-locutors or interlocutors had said. And he also made a little, draw a sketch in my notebook. And years later, I found that sketch and I wanted to say I can do something with that. So I decided okay, but years and years ago, I was making comic books. Let's make a comic book out of that. And then it got published. Another one got published. And then via mutual friends, when Rick had this idea of doing something on Bernard de Colmont, via mutual friend, he arrived at me. And then that was the start of 5 years of back and forth across the ocean via Zoom, via Teams, and an occasional meeting somewhere in a Starbucks in Belgium.
Well, In the Land of the Lacandon is an unusual book. I almost want to say unique. And I wonder if you could just start out actually by describing it for listeners who haven't gotten to read it.
In the Land of the Lacandon is a short book written for a more general public, perhaps even undergraduate audience, that tells the story of a French explorer who goes to Chiapas, southern Mexico, in the 1930s to be the first to film the Lacandon, quite famously, quote unquote, lost tribe. But of course, they're not lost at all. And to tell this story, we have tried to do it in multiple genres, in multiple medias. So there's 4 main components to the book. So the first is a graphic history telling the story of Bernard de Colmont and his adventures as he described them, importantly. And then there's a historical essay after that, sort of historicizing Bernard de Caumont and exploration and the Lacandon and all that sort of stuff. And then we have a contribution from Manuel Bolumpale, an indigenous writer, poet from Chiapas, who wrote a poem about this whole episode, a long poem that's printed both in Tzotzil Maya and in English. And then we have a dialogue among the three authors in which we sort of talk about process and method and what we were doing and what we were thinking and why we made choices that we made. So it's sort of it takes a little historical story and ruminates quite a bit on historical storytelling and what that looks like through different medium of writing.
How did you come to this project, and how did you come to work on it together?
About a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago, I was brought in to be the historical consultant on a documentary film that had significant focus on Bernard de Caumont. And in 1938, the film is about this moment in his life when he kayaks down the Green and Colorado rivers, and he films it in color film. And so the filmmaker was a local Portland filmmaker, and he sort of recreated that trip of kayaks following that route and what it looks like now and that sort of stuff. That documentary film is called Voyagers Without Trace. The filmmaker was Ian McCluskey. So I was introduced to Bernard de Caumont by being brought into this film project, and then learned about this trip to Mexico that had happened a few years earlier than the subject of the film. And anyway, Bernard de Caumont has lots of interesting aspects and dimensions to his life. And so my initial idea was a book that would sort of, each chapter would be in a different genre, would adopt a different sort of genre of sort of telling these different episodes of Bernard de Caumont's life. For example, the chapter after this graphic history was going to be, what does it look like when a historian writes a history in the style of a historical romance, for example, which is what I was working on when the book project eventually fell apart because of, elder care. It had elder care duties. So I wanted to play with historical methodology and historical storytelling and genre, and I also wanted to collaborate. So one of the things I liked about being on this film was sort of seeing, okay, how's this filmmaker approaching this topic, and sort of the behind the scenes. I love behind the scenes things, sort of seeing how things are made, how things are done. Anyway, so I was describing this to Stephen already mentioned, this mutual friend, Paul Silverstein, who's an anthropologist here in Portland at Reed College. And I was describing to him, I think I want to do something really different. Backpack Ambassadors had just come out, which was this huge, huge project, a big monograph. And I was like, okay, I feel like I've done that. And I want to do something creative, possibly artful. And I said, gosh, this episode of Mexico really seems like it ought to be a comic. It ought to be I was familiar with mid-20th century Francophone comics. My very first publication was a journal article about, censorship of comics in the mid-20th century in France. So quite familiar with the genre, but I'm not an artist at all. And anyway, Paul said, you should talk to Stephen van Wolputte, because he's been experimenting with graphic ethnography. Like, he's been incorporating graphic and comics into his ethnography as an anthropologist. And the fact that Stephen was an anthropologist was great also, because Bernard de Caumont is there doing an ethnographic film, right? And so we had a collaboration then of, historian and anthropologist, researcher and graphic illustrator. And so that's how it came together.
Stephen, what did you think when you heard about this project?
I was intrigued. That's one thing. And Rick was very enthusiastic about the entire project, even though I must admit, and he knows it, that he was like a little hungover when we met for the first time. Sorry, Rick, I had to mention that.
I know. Yes.
Yeah. We are both
Belgian beer.
We are both beer aficionados, so that also helps. Anyway, so I was enthused by his enthusiasm, and then what also played a role. So we met, I think, Rick, was it in December 2019 or so, around that time. And
Yes.
then, so we parted ways, and then we started to kind of, like think about it and ruminate on it. And then COVID struck. And that first year, I think I made one or two drawings just to, like COVID time, spend some time. And then I sent it to Rick, and then it was like, yeah, okay, let's do this. And then at first, the very first version was like 15 pages or so. That was finished one year or 2 years after our first meeting. And then we thought like there is more to it. And then so it kind of evolved in subsequent versions with lots of back and forth on and Rick really knows his comics, so that also helped. And it was also that we had really fun discussions online. Really knows his comics, and then that link was also not that far-fetched because the early comics in the 20s, 30s, they were of course also in black and white, and you had many of them, if not all of them, they were about adventures in faraway places. Tarzan is just perhaps the best known, and of course the Belgian connection, Tintin, who around that time was about to publish. Hergé was about to publish his third or his fourth album by then. So, and again, Rick mentioned French censorship, which was a very important element also in Belgian comic production.
What was the process like for producing the project? How did you work together?
I did the archival research. I did, archival research in France and the US and Mexico, turned up quite a few periodical publications he makes two trips, as you know. After the first trip, there's a press conference in Hollywood, actually, and sort of gets covered pretty widely. And then de Comont himself authored a few like magazine spread sort of things. And of particularly value in an archive, I found radio transcripts of a radio program of basically, 10 to 12 page scripts that he had written as radio lectures, and also did some archival work in Mexico. And so I would sort of, as I was doing this, I would feed stuff to Stephen, and he was really in charge of the graphic, thinking about, he laid out a storyboard and was doing the drawings, and we would confer quite a bit. And I would be working on the essay and fleshing it out and doing more digging into secondary source, research that needed to be done to figure out what was going on. And we would sort of say, okay, so I'm going to be able to dedicate time working on this the last 2 weeks of February or whatever. Like we would just sort of share each other's schedule and when we thought we could hunker down, and sort of set a loose deadline for when we would sort of exchange and then comment and revise. And so we would have, meetings on video and share things via email.
Exactly. And then Rick fed me with the archival materials and stuff. There was also a movie that de Comont had made in, help me, Rick, 1937 it was published.
It came out, in 37.
So we also got hold of that, and I was feeding him with drawings and ideas, and he also commented a lot on not just on the drawings but also on the storyline, the dialogues, which, as you know, is the most difficult thing to write, also in comics. Also because the space that you have is quite limited, so you really have to kind of boil it down to the very essence. And so it went back and forth a couple of times, and then once that we had something that we thought was presentable, then we shared it with colleagues. I shared it with my students, and so on and so on.
Yeah, we would. I think Stephen, I don't know when you started referring to them as version 1.0, version 2.0, version 3. Like that became the version that once we got to a certain point and we felt like, okay, let's share it with people and get some feedback. And so that would be different people. So, I would typically send it to historians and with expertise in particular areas, and Stephen would send it to anthropologists with expertise in particular, and some people who were experts or had expertise in graphic stuff and that sort of thing. So that was quite influential and shaped quite a bit. So, for example, version 1.0, when it was like the graphic was maybe, I don't know, 14, 15 pages, and the essay was maybe 6,000 words or so. That's the initial thing we shared with about half a dozen people. one of whom was Alice Conklin, who's a historian at Ohio State and an expert on French imperialism, who wrote a book on the Museum of Man, which features significantly in this. And she wrote back very quickly, very enthusiastically. It was still pretty rough, but she said, oh my goodness, this, I imagine, as I said, she said Ohio State, I imagine being able to teach with this, that this would be such a tool for me to talk to my, I think she said my Big 10, now it's the Big 16, I don't know what it is now, but to talk to reach those students. And at that point, we hadn't yet fully decided that we were going to lean into this as a teaching tool. But that really helped us sort of, we'd already been thinking about it, but it helped us sort of go, okay. So it somewhat in my head, at least, I had, in my head, who the audience was students in a modern European history class at Ohio State.
And that is also what germinated Rick. It was basically Rick's idea to have to basically said like, why don't you draw me and introduce an avatar, Rick the avatar. And so that was also the idea behind situating its start and ending of the graphic in a lecture hall.
Yeah, the avatar is actually, we didn't originally have Avatar Rick in there. We had a few problems or a few challenges that we needed to deal with, and Avatar Rick helped us deal with that. First is, one thing that's quite unique about this, the graphic history part of this, is both the images and the narration are based on primary sources. Most graphic histories, the images are invented, as is the dialogue. But we had Bernard de Commont's words through those radio lectures and his magazine articles. And we had images. We had dozens of photographs, and we had a film. So we really wanted Bernard de Comment to tell the story, but we needed to distinguish Bernard de Commont's voice from our voice as authors. We didn't want the reader to confuse those things. So Avatar Rick helped us distinguish that. And it also helped us introduce a means of sort of very subtle citation. So there's no footnotes in the graphic history, but any speech bubble that's, black text on a white is all primary source, and anything that's white text on black is Avatar Rick speaking, and that's the secondary information and source criticism. And so it enabled us to sort of visually create kind of a citation system of showing how primary and secondary material works together. But it also helped us to introduce the topic and move from the graphic into the essay. We were really concerned that the reader would read the graphic and then not continue into the next part, the essay. And so by having Avatar Rick sort of frame that story in that classroom lecture hall, at the end, when we have those students ask those questions in the graphic, and Avatar Rick, it's a way of inviting the reader to sort of recognize, oh, there's still so much more to the story, and keep reading, turn the page, and now read the essay. So it solved like a bunch of different challenges that we were facing.
What you now told in, say, 3 or 4 minutes actually took 4 years, but just a little note.
Stephen, were there other challenges that you encountered of presenting these primary sources visually?
Yeah, but I also did, what you can call visual research, such as like the vehicles that we use. They're supposed to be more or less historically correct, because we don't know what vessel he took to cross the ocean. But I found a vessel that was called Mexico, and that was traveling between France and Mexico, for instance. That was very likely, or not unlikely at least, that he was on that one. So that was one thing, and we tried to stay as close as possible to the visuals that we did have. But that also meant, for instance, because the film was shot on 60 millimeters in the 1930s, that's very coarse and very coarse grain, and it was very difficult to kind of include the video stills, because when you print them, you can hardly see anything. You see some black and some white spots and stuff. But with drawings, you can do something with that. You can, but much of these drawings were based on actual footage and photographs. And then one challenge was then, how do you fill in the blanks? And so I haven't I don't have the count in my head, Rick, but we once made a count like these were, like images that were derived directly from primary sources, and these were the images that we kind of made up. And sometimes you need to intervene, as I said, also to present the interaction between people that of course that you kind of fill in the gaps to make the story more fluent and to continue to tell the story. Because storytelling, I mean, one big challenge for everyone, also when you write anthropology or history, but also when you make drawings, is to kind of bring a narrative, bring a story that is not only that not only says something, but that is also captivating, that also drags the reader into the story, and that is always okay. Being an academic, being an academic, that is especially a challenge. Without dumbing it down and wanting to say something, wanting to say what you want to say, but in a way that people A, understand it, and secondly, B, that it is good to read, which is another challenge. Hence also the importance of dialogue, which of course in a written text you can hide behind descriptions of the landscape or whatever. But in a graphic, actually, apart from the drawings, the written text that is there is basically all dialogue. And that is for me, that is also in my academic stuff, that is also one of the more, like you mentioned, Kate, challenging aspects of the storytelling, to keep the narrative going and at the same time convey ideas, basically.
Right, but you also, but you're conveying information. I mean, I didn't do any of the drawings, so this is Stephen. But you convey information visually too, right?
Of course.
You're conveying some of that content that in a written narrative would be descriptive through a visual presentation.
And visually, when you work with visuals, you do have a number of advantages. For instance, it is relatively easy to express, take now emotion or emotional states, because you can see the face and you can manipulate eyebrows and mouth and all that stuff. And of course, the descriptions that normally take up quite some space in anthropology books, for instance, like this is how the landscape looks like, this is how the house looks like. That is what you convey quite directly or more directly via an image, on the condition, of course, that your readership is able to read images, because that's another thing, and that is also what we were hoping for, at least. So that also means, what level of detail do you include? For instance, do you work with color? We decided against that to remain in the spirit of 1930s comic culture. So yeah, these are all decisions that were taken in the course of those 5 years.
We would occasionally disagree about things, and one of us would sort of convince the other one. So I'll give an example. This is one that Stephen won this one. So you might recall in the graphic, there's a page where Bernard de Caumont is sort of in this superhero pose, and he's all big, muscly, and that sort of stuff. We knew we needed to do more commentary about gender and masculinity, and we had the textual, the narrative stuff that we could sort of use to talk about that, but we didn't have anything visually that necessarily would work. And so Stephen presented this superhero pose, of a big, burly, like Paul Bunyan-y sort of Bernard de Caumont. And I was like, this isn't really, if we're sticking to primary sources, this isn't really a primary source. He says, yeah, but this is doing multiple things, right? It's calling attention to the emergence of the superhero comic, which was exactly at this moment. It's suggesting that, but also this is a way, this is a visual interpretation of what these words are describing here, that we have this journalist sort of describing de Caumont. And this is an interpretation of a primary source, but it's visual, and it was like, okay, you're right. You're right.
Explain it better than I could, but okay.
I loved all the different components of this book. It's so interesting. I too thought about how great it would be to teach with this, because you sort of like have a narrative, but then you deconstruct how that narrative comes together. Did you always have all of those components in mind, or did some emerge as you were working on the project?
We knew components would be part of it. We didn't necessarily know what it would be or what they would look like. I tend, as a researcher and particularly as a writer, I figure things out as I go. So, Kate, I've listened to your podcast quite a bit, and of course, so many of your authors are producing trade press books, And I hear these descriptions of these proposals, right? These detailed proposals in which I'm like, I can't do that. Like, I don't know. I don't know until I'm in it and figuring it out as I go. So, we knew the graphic would be a part of it. We knew there'd be an essay about it. And of course, we had the dilemma of the La Condon. Like, Bernard de Caumont never lets them speak, right? They never articulate anything in his tellings, various tellings of this episode. But we knew we didn't want to speak for them. We knew we didn't want to invent anything. In part because we wanted to call attention to it. We wanted to call attention to this, in the graphic and in the essay. And so we just started to think about, well, what could we do? We thought we need someone indigenous to do something. And so I went to the library, and started doing some more reading and came across Manuel's work and just thought, ooh, this fella's, I like what he's doing. I like his work. And it took a while to get in contact with him. And then we just sort of said, listen, do you want to, he does poetry, he does photographic essays, he does, short stories. He's sort of does lots of different things. We just sort of said, do you want to participate? Here's what we're doing. Here's our materials as far as we've gotten, which would probably be version 3.0 or 4.0. The manual came in. I think the published version's maybe version 6.0, I would guess. And he saw what we were doing, and then he says, yeah, all right. And not long after, a couple of months later, it's pretty fast, really, we got this poem, that was like this extended version from the point of view of the La Condon. And it just opened up so much more, right? Sort of one thing about this project that sort of evolved as we did it is, what does a historian do? How do they think about these questions? What's their method? Same thing with anthropologists. And then we have a poet. And what a contrast that poem is to the comic and to the essay. And at the same time, each of those pieces are sort of commenting on each other. One thing I really love about it is, and one thing we played up, is how each approach has its advantages and its disadvantages. That is, they each have limitations to what within the realm of methods and process of what they can do, and therefore what they can each contribute. So, for example, the poem. So as historians, right, one thing we struggle with a lot is interiority, right, motives and stuff, because unless you have, which is rare, you actually have a source that really articulates your historical subjects' interiority, what they're thinking and why they're doing things and that sort of stuff. And so we write around those things as best we can because it's difficult to comment on that stuff. And we draw attention to that. I mean, we wanted to draw attention in the comic and in the essay to the limitations of what was knowable, right? We very much point out what questions we weren't able to answer through research, that we couldn't find those answers. And then the poem comes in and it's all about interiority, right? It's all about subjectivity. And Manuel writes in the voice of these different La Condon, describing sort of very situated in place and in nature and in the jungle. And so I love that, right? And then the dialogue at the end, which is another traditional form of writing, gives us a chance as the authors to likewise dig into what we were thinking and why we were thinking that and what the challenges were. So, I mean, all of that sort of gets figured out as we went. To answer your original question about the components, I very much, this is true of my monographs too, I figure it out as I go. Once I have a piece figured out, then I figure out, okay, what's the piece that needs to come before that? And then what would logically follow, and things sort of build out like that.
Same here. I also like to figure it out as I go along. And also I'm an amateur, so I can do that. Amateur drawer. I'm not a professional artist, on the contrary. So, but I also like to figure out how to make that particular drawing. And there were many, many failed attempts, by the way, for each and every drawing.
I think it's really interesting, this book. This book has two additional components, too. There's a discussion guide at the end. And then there's also a really interesting note section where you were not only sort of citing your sources, but also they're kind of discursive, talking about how those sources became images and what went into them. How did you think about those sections too?
Go ahead, Stephen. You wrote the notes, so.
I thought it was important that, I mean, okay, in a graphic you don't include footnotes. That would be awkward, to say the least. And footnotes in general are or can be quite awkward. But I thought it was also important for not just for the mentioning of the sources. That's one thing. And so that was where it started. And then I thought it was also important to kind of comment on these drawings in a way that helped people to situate not just where they came from, but also how to place them within the narrative. That's kind of a meta commentary. Also, I mean, drawing is much like writing, of course. And with visuals, you do have, like I said, it's not always, you can't always assume that your audience has the necessary visual literacy, if that is a term, in order to see where these images come from or what they mean or why they are they are framed like that, for instance, or for instance how to read the space between, the so-called gutter in comic book theory. And that is main, and I thought it was also fun to do and to also have some of my own ideas that I smuggled in. Not that that was an issue, because we had a lot of discussions and it was always, if I recall well, always very friendly and amicable. But
and we put in some Easter eggs. There's some Easter eggs in there too that are explained
true.
in the notes.
That was also a fun part.
Did you ever consider making it longer?
I mean, it kept getting longer. I mean, certainly initially, like when I first approached him, it was just going to be, a chapter in a bigger thing. And, we were imagining 12 to 15 pages, and it ended up like, I don't know, 50 plus maybe. But I feel like, Stephen, I feel like it's complete. However, this is kind of juicy. So about a month before the book came out, you might recall that Coleman made 2 trips. And the second trip, which is incorporated into the graphic, we didn't find a lot of material about. He returns to record their language after having made the first trip where he filmed them. Just like a month or maybe before the book came out, we were contacted by the grandson of his assistant on that second trip. He had, I don't know, he'd found out that we were doing some research on Bernard Coleman. He didn't know the book was about to come out. But anyway, he shared with us, his grandfather was an artist. And so he had all these sketches of the La Condon that his grandfather had made, and lots of additional photographs. His grandfather was also a musician and played the flute. And there's images of his grandfather with the La Condon playing musical instruments. And he told also a tale that supposedly, according to family lore, Bernard de Coleman abandoned him in Guatemala at the end of the trip, something we'd never heard before. So anyway, so there were, as it turns out, and there probably still are out there, materials that could have helped us make the graphic longer if we had found them or known about them. But of course, this also feeds back into our whole point that we make in the book to the reader about sources and what available source material allows you to say and questions it allows you to answer. And if you don't have the source material as a historian, it's really difficult to do those things. But then, there's stuff out there and you don't know if you could find it. But I think what we did, the story feels complete, right? Like the arc feels nicely accomplished narratively, I think.
When we finished a book, that was also the material that we had. It was only after it was already in print but not yet published that this email came along, which of course sparked ideas of like, maybe we can make a sequel, maybe we can make a part 2. But the jury is still out on that.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the publishing process. Was it challenging to find a publisher who shared your vision, who was willing to put all of this together?
Yes. Our initial thought was to publish with a comics publisher, but someone that did nonfiction and that sort of stuff. And Stephen even approached a small press in Belgium, and they were sort of, And then we approached a press in the United States that we were sort of keen on. They publish a lot in like medical anthropology and, lots of nonfiction, semi-scholarly stuff, but have a lot of experience doing that. And there was some initial interest from them, but then the editor was sort of not very responsive. And that's just, that's a red flag, for me. I've been very fortunate. All my books have been with university presses, but I've been very fortunate to have really responsive editors. But I've had friends who haven't. And so, that was just like, I don't know. And so then we started approaching other presses. I'll say, for example, Cornell was really interested, loved it, understood it, into it, but they hadn't published anything, graphic yet. And as Bethany Wasik, there was editor, as she said, I want to see this as a book, but I don't feel like, I'm not sure we can do it justice. I'm not sure. I don't want you to be the guinea pig. And then Emily Andrew at McGill Queen's University Press, I knew she had moved there, and I had been a reader. I'd worked for her as a reader of manuscripts before, and knew she was just really efficient and on it and direct, and I liked that. And that she was now at McGill Queen's, and they had published a book, a really good graphic history of Canadian soldiers in the First World War at Vimy Ridge and that sort of stuff a few years earlier. Like really nice, really well done, well produced color. And she and her colleagues at McGill Queen's immediately jumped on it. They got it. They understood it. Stephen and I were sort of like, we really want to get this done. We want to get this out. And they worked double time to make this happen. And so, yeah, very happy with the work that lots of people at McGill Queen's UP put into that.
Indeed, and this was the once that we had them on board, it was the smoothest process I've ever experienced. I think within a few weeks we had 3 reviews. A couple of weeks later there was a contract. And these are processes that in the academic world at least can take 2 years or longer. So this was like, oh, this is going really fast. And then a couple of months later the book was in the bookstores. But Rick, I also remember that one review that came out that started with the question like, how the hell did they ever were able to convince a publisher to get this out, because it was so different from all the normal things that come out. It was not not a graphic. Yeah, exactly.
There's no, you can't point to, it's this book is like these books. It's not quite like any other books that I know of.
So we took that as a compliment, by the way. But
oh yeah, he was happy. He was happy it was published. But the reviewer was like, "How did they ever convince a publisher to do this?"
Rick, in your email to me, you described this book as an experiment in form of historical storytelling, which I really liked. What do you think the results of the experiment were?
Good. I think they're good results. I guess I'm interested. So to go back a little bit, I enjoy reading and teaching graphic nonfiction, and I enjoy reading and teaching microhistories. And so this sort of was a way to sort of do both in terms of graphic nonfiction, which I'm not really into the superhero stuff like that. But I love graphic nonfiction, like Joe Sacco's journalism, Alison Bechdel's graphic memoirs. And I teach them, of course, well. I've taught Mouse so many times, and it works so well. And Michael Vann and Liz Clark's Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, also really excellent. And then there's other nonfiction, like Nick Sousanis's Unflattening, which is this just incredible intellectual project. It was his dissertation. It's in philosophy, and it's just epic and incredible, sort of a dissertation in the form of a graphic. And then, of course, microhistory is Natalie Davis's Return of Martin Guerre, which I've taught many times, Carlo Ginzburg, but also some that mess with form, like Luisa Passerini's Autobiography of a Generation, which is a microhistory I love, in which she tells sort of the late 60s, that 68 moment, in Italy and universities. She alternates between telling sort of what's going on with conversations with her therapist. And it's fascinating. Or Bonnie Smith's Confessions of a Concierge, which is a microhistory that plays in 3 parts, that plays with different voice and genre, fiction, nonfiction. And I've sort of always been interested in that line of when something's history and when something's fiction. And I sort of wanted to dance along that line and let people, say, oh, well, that goes too far. That's not, or something. No, fine. Either way, whatever way you think. But as we got into it, and as we said earlier, we figure it out as we go. It became an opportunity to emphasize and highlight methodology and what historians do and how they work with the sources and what they do when they don't have sources that answer questions. Usually we just sort of don't include it. Instead, this time we wanted to include those gaps. And then, how does a poet approach this story, and what sort of themes is a poet going to lean into and be interested in? And an anthropologist as well. One of the great things when we're doing the graphic and figuring it out along with the essay, those things were both produced in tandem. Stephen was like, we've got to do more with religion. This is the peak of his story when he gets to film them in the hut doing prayers. Stephen's intuition as an ethnographer and anthropologist sort of recognized that very quickly. It's like we've got to build this up more, and we need to talk about it more in the essay. And so having those brains situated within their genre and their disciplines, I think throws all that into relief in a really effective way. And so I think we say in there somewhere, not only do we want the reader to sort of think about this subject and this topic, but who's telling these stories? That is a historian, an anthropologist, and a poet, and how they do so. That then becomes a sort of a commentary on, I guess, on possibilities. Like what's possible? When I came across this story, I thought, gosh, this should be a graphic. Like it just that immediately sort of came out to me that like this should be a comic, given the way, the jungle and all that sort of stuff. I think part of it was, listening to your sources. What do your sources enable you to say and do? What can you do with them and still be adhering to professional standards, I guess, and how those professional standards differ between the different disciplines?
One thing that and I know it also interests you, Rick, is also that when we talk about that interbellum period, when we talk about the 1930s, we also talk about today's popular culture, where you still have the idea of going somewhere and finding a treasure, being on a quest, that kind of the very similar themes that you find not just in Hollywood movies, but in many novels, for instance, and the kind of exoticization that you find, that you see throughout, not just in superhero movies, but basically in not almost all, but in many of the so-called adventure genre that we still kind of, that you find also in computer games, for instance. And the kernel, the origin of that idea of exploration, discovery, that you find in the end of the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th, mainly that period, that century, second half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, is still around us, but the kernel is actually originates there. And actually, most of the more mainstream comic books are about a repetition of the same little big theme. So in that sense, we also wanted to kind of not point fingers, but just to kind of very subtly remind people, like, well, Indiana Jones is not that original. So and he still is this kind of, like looking for the Inca treasure, whatever it is that he's looking for, and running away from boulders. That is basically what De Clement was also doing. Not boulders in this case, but
it's a short book, but there's a lot in it. Like it's doing a lot of things, I think. And part of it is a history of popular culture in this interwar period and how ideas for white populations in Europe and North America, how the indigenous other was sort of constructed in this sort of hierarchy of civilizations, hierarchy of race through popular culture, because that's what Bernard de Clement is doing himself, right? He makes a film, he does radio lectures, magazine articles. And so part of this is a little bit of a history of popular culture of this era and how those ideas circulated, about the other with the capital O, in addition to sort of a little bit of a history of exploration, who were, celebrity exploration, I should say. Like this was a whole thing. And of course, relationships of, histories of imperialism and France's interest in Mexico. And like it just touches on a lot of different things.
And just to add just one more layer, it's also the role of visual culture in our popular culture, that the big moments of exploration and quote unquote exploration, discovery, colonialism, they go hand in hand with the arrival of first photography in say second half of the 19th century, and then later on film that became like a film camera became affordable for say middle class families in the course of the 1920s, 1930s. I would really love to do something with family movies, but that's not my expertise. But that would be great because that is also where people start to film their trip to the seashore, or children having their birthday, and so on and so on and so on. So that visuality, which is like a difficult word to talk about visual culture, the visuality that has permeated our imagination of the other capital O other and of ourselves, that has had and is having such an important impact on who we think we are.
Can you imagine Bernardo Como in the era of Instagram? He would have been an influencer.
Sure. Oh my God.
Well, Rick in his answer gave me quite a good reading list. Stephen, are there people who you read for inspiration?
If you want to know like what book would I recommend, because Rick already mentioned a few titles, but one that I was really impressed by was Ginger Roots by Craig Thompson, which is a story about ginger, the root. And it's also a family chronicle of the American Midwest and how he grew up in a very conservative religious family and tried to literally draw his way out. It's also at the same time a story about ginger cultivation over there and the difference. And then he also goes to China and stuff. Anyway, and it's first of all, it's fantastically, from a graphic point of view, from a visual point of view, it's fantastic. But also, it's such a good story where you also that is something that we all like, I guess, where you have different layers that you can, like discover as you are reading and as you are rereading, and every time that you read, you come across something that you haven't seen before or thought of before, and then you go like, "Whoa!" And that is one of those books that is. It's not that it's quite recent. It's from 24, I guess, but it's one of those books that I cherish. Yeah. Much of his work, if not all of his work, by the way, is really great. But this one really stands out as one of the best graphic novels that I've ever come across.
Having worked on this book together, do you think that this experience will affect the way you write and the way you work going forward?
Absolutely. Like I liked collaborating. There's a way in which having a good collaborator. I've never been one to participate a whole lot. I know a lot of people do, and it works for them, writing groups and that sort of stuff. That sort of keeps you accountable. But having a collaborator also keeps you accountable. So, like for example, Stephen mentioned COVID hit, and so all of a sudden everything shut down. And that moment in the spring and early summer of 2020, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going on or what's going to happen. This sort of stuff. And all of a sudden, Stephen sends me some images. Says, I've been working on this. He'd been working on it. I had stopped because I'm like, well, because I actually had a research trip planned to Mexico that summer, and that had to be canceled. And so I was just sort of stagnated and had stopped and just thought, well, I guess this isn't going to happen. But then Stephen comes through and is like, oh, look, I've been doing this. Here's what I've been working on. Da, da, da. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. Get back to my desk. Right. So I like that. I also I'd like to do something creative. Whatever it is next is going to be something that stimulates me both intellectually, but also creatively. What that is, I don't know, because it's going to have to emerge from an engagement with the material, whatever it is. What does that material make possible, enable? What's feasible? What could I do? Who might want to join me in this and contribute whatever they might contribute? Yeah, I think part of it, and this is also true for both of us. We commented on this. Stephen and I are similar points in our careers. We can't be promoted anymore. No, nobody's going to come. Nobody's going to come, recruiting us to move to their program and that sort of stuff. So there's a way in which, when we started this project, we sort of, we're like, well, we can do what we want. We don't have to get approval from any sort of promotion committee or departmental. And that's liberating, right? So like, what do I want to do? And how would I go about doing it?
I agree. I mean, the freedom that you have at the stage of our life or career or whatever you want to call it is a present. And like Rick said, I really appreciate. We are both individualists, and most academics are basically, especially when you're sitting behind your desk writing away or drawing away or whatever. But then it is fine that you find that you come across kindred spirits or something, and that you kind of together work on a project, but without having 25 people looking over your shoulder. And it was also, I mean, it was also a really nice collaboration, and it resulted in something which also kind of helps. But yeah, and it's good sometimes to break away from or to break out of your academic silos. And the fact I've been working on historical stuff as well, doing some archival work. I'm not an historian, but I did some archival work, and it was I always had this interest in history, and then finding someone with similar ideas or similar approach to our materials are very different, right? And in my my current future, how you call this, one of my current future projects is I have like 30 years of ethnographic material, and I want to do something with that. Hopefully, not hopefully, also something creative with some graphic stuff included, but at the same time also something hybrid academic. But we will figure it out as we go along.
Before I let you go, I'd like to ask you both, what's the most influential writing advice or perhaps creative advice you've ever gotten?
The one thing that sticks out to me is back doing dissertation work. My dissertation director, Bonnie Smith, I was two things. She gave me two pieces of advice that were really helpful. One was about I was I work in European history, and so I work in foreign languages. And I was having trouble figuring out how to translate something, how to quote something. And she made some comments. She said, "Well, that's probably not a problem with your French. That's a problem with your English." And her point was, you understand what the French says. How would you say it in English? How would a person listening to English understand this point? And it was sort of, it was a point about being, much more fluid and nimble, not very directly word by word by word translate. And then the other thing, I don't remember what it was, but there was something I just couldn't figure out. And it was like, maybe I'll just take, I won't deal with this. I'll take this out. And Bonnie also said, no. The obstacle is the opportunity. Figure it out. Figuring it out, and you will have something much better, much smarter. That's where the opportunity is to do something, to think something, is figuring out the obstacle.
Same here. Best advice people gave me was just do some writing, do write, and it's first draft or zero draft writing, and afterwards you will, like work it and edit it and probably delete half of it at least. And another one was that was basically also what Rick just said, like look at the frictions, look at where you see resistance and where you find yourself feeling resistance to write about stuff. And that is where, like you will, in the best of cases, you will find that diamond that you're looking for.
Now, my writing advice would be always be revising. Like you think Glenn Ross, always be closing, always be revising. Whenever I return to whatever I'm working on, I always reread, so I get my head wherever my head was when I left it. But also I'm constantly editing and wordsmithing and doing that's my favorite part of writing is once you have it, the rough stuff out there, the crafting of it and that sort of stuff. Yeah, always be revising is sort of something I practice myself.
It also takes up most of the time.
Well, Rick and Stephen, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past, giving me the chance to read this book and to talk about it. I'm excited to see it out in the world.
Thank you. We're excited too. Yep. People have been teaching it, and that's awesome.
Also from here, thank you, Kate. This was a fun talk.
Thanks again to Rick Jobs and Stephen van Wolputte for joining me for this conversation. You can find links to In the Land of the Lacandon and many other great books mentioned in this episode in the show notes. In case you haven't heard the news, Drafting the Past is expanding in October, and I am thrilled for all that is to come. Head to draftingthepast.com to learn more and subscribe so you don't miss a thing. And if you'd like to be done with the pesky ads interfering with your listening experience, reminder that paying subscribers get access to an ad-free podcast feed, among other perks. Thanks for listening and for remembering that friends don't let friends write boring history.